Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar organized by SHARE and NERIS platforms, which is focusing on the key challenges for managing the transition phase based on lessons we have learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents. The aim of this webinar is to draw together insights from a variety of top experts on the transition phase activity in nuclear or radiological emergency situations, as well as to reflect on relationships with the COVID-19 context. My name is Ferdiana Hoti, and I will be moderating today's webinar. I am a PhD researcher at the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, SEK-CEN, as well as at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. The webinar today will have the following structure. First, each of the speakers will have 5 minutes to present their insight on the topics we asked them to cover. And then in the end, we will have an open discussion with all of our panelists. If you have any questions you would like our speakers to answer, please use the chat function available at the bottom line of Zoom. Dr. Nadia Železnik will be following the chat and will collect the questions, which will be afterwards addressed by our speakers. The webinar will be also recorded together with your questions, and you will be able to find it at the SHARE website. With us, we also have SHARE President, Professor Susan Molyneux-Hodgson, as well as NERIS representative, Professor Deborah Otton, in order to give us the closing remarks for the webinar. We expect to finish the webinar around 4:30. Before we start, I would like to ask all the speakers to shortly introduce themselves, focusing on the background and most important experience for today's webinar. Dr. Thierry Schneider, we can start with you.
Thank you, and good afternoon or good morning for some of you, everybody. So I'm very pleased to be there for this webinar. I'm Thierry Schneider, so Director of CEPN, the Nuclear Protection Evaluation Center in France. And I'm also the chair of the NERIS platform, who is a co-organizer jointly with the SHARE platform. NERIS platform is dedicated to research on emergency and recovery. And just a few words about my experience. I have been involved in the post-accident management since 1990 in the international Chernobyl project, and then following some project in Belarus on post-accident management for more than 20 years. And then, unfortunately, when the Fukushima accident occurred, and then I am involved in with some Japanese colleagues to work in the Fukushima post-accident management. And I'm also involved since a long time in the CODIRPA project with preparedness in France. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Toshimitsu Homa, you may continue.
Thank you, Federiana, and thank you all participants for giving me this opportunity. I'm Toshimitsu Homa. My background is physics and nuclear engineering. I have been long involved in Nuclear Safety Research Center in the Japan Atomic Energy Agency. I was working mainly in the field of risk assessment of nuclear installations, in particular probabilistic accident consequence assessment of nuclear power plants. After the Tokaimura criticality accident in 1999, I moved to research work on emergency preparedness using risk assessment techniques. At the time of Fukushima accident, I have been involved in several advice for decision-making, in particular during the early phase as an advisor of the former Nuclear Safety Commission. Now I am working in Nuclear Regulation Authority in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. We may continue with you, Professor Elizabeth Cardis.
Thank you, Verdiana. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cardis. I'm the head of the radiation program at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health, IES Global, and I'm research professor in radiation and environmental epidemiology. Before that, over 12 years ago, I was the head of the radiation program at the International Agency for Research on Cancer in Lyon, part of the World Health Organization. I've been involved with radiation accidents since very early after the Chernobyl accident, and mainly on the somatic effects of radiation and more recently in the last 3 or 4 years on the psychosocial effects also of emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you. It's your turn, Professor Jacques Lechaud.
Hello to everyone. I'm very pleased to share this session with all of you, I hope from all over the world. Well, I have been involved for 30 years in radiological protection. And over the last 30 years, mainly dealing with post-accident, post-nuclear accident situations, and focusing my work on stakeholder involvement. I am currently professor at Nagasaki University in Japan, and also the vice chair of the International Commission on Radiological Protection. Thank you.
Thank you. May we continue with Dr. Edward Lazo.
Thank you very much. My name is Ted Lazo. I'm currently the Secretariat of the Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health of the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency, where I've been for the last 28 years. And I'm responsible for all our radiological protection programs there. I began my work life at 3 Mile Island just after the accident to do the cleanup, well, the remanagement of the accident. I've worked at national laboratories in the United States. I'm an American by birth, but I'm naturalized French, and I've been in France for 30 years. I've been asked to discuss stakeholders in transition, and I've been working with stakeholders in terms of learning from the Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and other aspects, how the radiological protection experts should interact with stakeholders and support stakeholders. So I've had a lot of experience in that regard, and I hope to be able to present a little bit of that to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Dr. Catherine Turcano. Can you please present yourself?
Hello, Ferdiana, and hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be part of this webinar. I'm Catherine Turcano. I work for the Belgian Nuclear Research Center, where I had a multidisciplinary unit called Nuclear Science and Technology Studies, which looks at social and ethical aspects of nuclear technologies and applications of ionizing radiation. Myself, I've been working for now 25 years on different aspects of emergency management, including decision support tools and models, where I also did my PhD. And recently I coordinated the European Engage project, which looked at stakeholder engagement practices in relation to radiological protection, and nuclear emergency management was one of the areas we covered. And I'm also chairing recently started project of the Environet network of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which tries to develop more comprehensive approaches to decision-making for sustainable environmental remediation and integrated environmental management. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker for today is Dr. Chiara McMahon. Can you please introduce yourself, Chiara?
Yes, good afternoon, Ferdiana. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ciara McMahon. I'm a program manager in the Environmental Protection Agency, where I'm responsible for the Environment and Health Programme. The EPA in Ireland is also the radiation protection regulator and competent authority, as well as doing environmental protection. As well as responsibility for nuclear and environmental emergency preparedness, my responsibilities include RADON, our air quality monitoring and assessment program, citizen science, non-ionizing radiation, radiation services for companies in Ireland, and noise mapping. And previously I was program manager for radioactivity environmental monitoring and the regulation of radiation sources in Ireland. In the emergency preparedness field, I was previously co-chair of the NEA's Working Party in Nuclear Emergency Matters. I was on the stakeholder advisory panel of the EU Engage project that Catherine described. And I also worked with the IAEA in development of the General Safety Guide for termination of the emergencies, which is all about what arrangements you need to put in place during the transition phase, as well as a tech doc for food and drinking water radioactivity standards after emergencies. I'm currently on the management board of NERIS and on the bureau of the NEA's Committee on Radiation Protection and Public Health. and the Irish representative on NSREG, which is the European Nuclear Safety Regulators Group. Nationally, I'm a member of the National Emergency Coordination Group in Ireland, and have been involved on that decision-making body for weather emergencies, flooding, and also during the Fukushima accident.
Thank you very much to all of you for introducing yourself and introducing us to your experience that is relevant to today's topic. Now we would like to go on with to discuss the topics that we assigned for you, as well as your reflection on these aspects. I would like to start with Dr. Thierry Schneider. So Thierry, based on your experience, can you please introduce to us what do we mean by transition phase, and what are some criteria, examples, and some challenges of the transition phase?
Okay, thank you, Ferdiana. So this is a difficult duty to give you a flavor of what do we mean by transition phase. So I will, especially in 5 minutes. So I will try to do my best. And of course, my colleagues will go more in detail in some of the elements later on. First of all, what we mean by the transition phase is the fact that after the Chernobyl accident, one of the key lessons was the fact that after early countermeasures, which mean evacuation, sheltering, and iodine distribution tablet, or food and water restriction, the end of the story, that was not the end of the story. You still have to think about the key protective action to be set in place for a long-term period. This has been re-emphasized after the Fukushima accident. So clearly, when we have large dispersion of radionuclide in the environment, the transition phase is quite critical and need to be considered. So first of all, when we can say, what is the beginning of the transition phase? Mainly, this is something which could be decided by the authority as soon as they have the feeling, they have information that the damaged installation does not present any more threat or significant threat for the population. So if you come back to Fukushima and Chernobyl accident, you see that it's not so simple to declare if it is on this day or the other day that you really have the transition phase, but progressively you move toward the transition phase. Then, of course, when you start the transition phase, the key point is to decide for the authority how to lift early protective measures and on which to do it. Of course, the key point for the authority is to set up some program of protective action in order to protect the people and the environment. On the other side, of course, even if the transition phase starts, you still have to, for the operators, there is still a need to secure, to further secure the installation and to, so I will not go in this detail, but I will mainly focus on what to do for the population and the environment. So what are the key issues at the beginning of this transition phase? The first point for the authority will be to decide how to allow the people and what are the conditions and the criteria to allow the people to live in some specific areas, but also to decide in which area people are no more able to live for a period of time or for a longer period. And they have first to adopt some relevant radiological criteria as far as radiation protection is concerned, mainly in terms of individual dose, but it's also to embark some non-radiological criteria for taking the decision. And we will have the opportunity during this webinar to further investigate that. For example, after the Fukushima, like also after the Chernobyl accident, with regard to the radiological criteria, that was a large number of debate to see exactly which type of reference level is meaningful for the protection of people in this period of time. But also there were some discussion about the school, what to do with the school, how to allow the children to come back, is it the same radiological criteria and so on? And is there any sufficient activity, shops, economic activity to allow and to consider the future of the population in these territories? So this is some of the challenge. The second point after that is to refine the radiological characterization of the environment. There is a need to set up radiological monitoring program. This has been largely done after Chernobyl and Fukushima, and we have the experience reveals that it takes time to have detailed characterization, not only based on the average ground deposition, but also embarking the specific day-to-day activity of the people, and go to not only average, but also the distribution of exposure. Based on all this characterization, progressively the authority are in position to define a set of protective action to cope with the situation. This action will concern food restriction, but also the reorganization of the agriculture. You can see what has been done with regard to rice production after Fukushima, or to the milk production after Chernobyl. This has changed the day-to-day life and the economic and agriculture production. But there is also the need to define what could be the program of decontamination, and also how to reorganize the social and economic activities. For example, we have seen after Fukushima that some schools have been closed in some villages, have been reorganized with other villages, or progressively we started with some specific condition. Or after Chernobyl, the school children were proposed not only to have reorganization of their school, but also to have some period of in sanatorium in order to be outside the area. So progressively, all these protective actions are put in place, and then there is a need to end the transition phase and to go toward the recovery process. And for that, there is still another set of discussion to embark some consideration on what does it mean for the future of the territories. And for this purpose, the local authority has clearly to rely on stakeholder involvement. This is not something which could be decided only by some national authorities, but there is a need to really embark radiological issue together with non-radiological issue to define what could be the future of these territories. So I will not go too much in detail because the other speaker will provide some consideration on different issues. Notably, there will be discussion on establishing a transparent and inclusive decision-making process. There will be some discussion on ethical values, some discussion on what to do with adequate health surveillance to cope with this situation, but also addressing properly economic, social, environmental challenge. And of course, all these elements need to rely on the practical experience and the lessons learned from Fukushima and Chernobyl, and really to put in place some management which allow to cope with the complexity of the situation. And of course, to finish, I would say that it's not only the management at the time of the accident or during the transition phase, but preparedness is quite important to be considered. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Thierry, for providing us the introduction, as well as tell us about challenges and examples of the transition phase. You also mentioned experience and lessons based on Chernobyl and Fukushima. So we would like to go a bit deeper into the experiences of Japan related to the transition phase following the Fukushima accident. Mr. Toshimitsu Homa, can you please tell us about what has been done in Japan and what lessons can we draw from this? And I will support you with one slide.
Yes. Thank you, Adriana.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I will show you one slide. This is a timeline for managing the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. You can see specific dates between phases, but these specific dates were based on notification by the authority, mainly on the basis of controllability of plant status. However, in reality, of course, there is no discontinuity of various activities. But the concept of phases is considered very useful for the development of protection strategy, as well as a common understanding about among various stakeholders involved. This slide shows what have been done during the transition phase in the lower part of the slide. I will touch on these main activities and the 3 points: planning during the transition phase, characterization of the situation, and lifting of specific protective actions. On 17th May 2011, the policy and immediate actions and the roadmap was established by the government. This roadmap listed 9 groups of actions to be taken that was scheduled over different target time periods based on plant status. These actions were steps to be taken for restricted areas, ensure the safety and reassurance of people affected, secure employment, support the local municipalities, and compensation to sufferers, and so on. Although these preparedness for process of transition was not enough undertaken prior to the accident, the development of this roadmap was very useful for providing a good perspective for effective long-term recovery operations. What level of details do we need to have arrangement for recovery process at the preparedness stage? The accent is site-specific, plant-specific, scenario-specific, and environmental condition-specific. So we need to have a framework for recovery management and mechanisms to coordinate all relevant stakeholders at the preparedness stage. But during the transition phase, detailed protection strategies for recovery process needs to be developed in terms of information available, time frames for priority for decision making, and implementation of specific protective actions and priorities to be achieved. During June and July, the government established detailed and comprehensive monitoring program to determine the role for coordinating activities among various organizations involved. Characterization is a key during transition phase for preparing any kind of activities for preparing resumption of normal activities. During the transition phase, it may be necessary to modify the initial protective actions and to introduce new ones. The method to characterize the exposure situations depends on the objective of actions to be taken, from a wide range of aerial monitoring and mapping of the position to capture the overall situation, to better characterize the exposure situation to identify people who are exposed and will expose in the future, already Terry mentioned. In this phase, another activities such as health surveillance by Fukushima Prefecture and the remediation process with decontamination and waste management started. Since we do not have any law-related contaminated waste, we need to establish, act on special measures on these issues. But I will not go in detail in this issue. The third point is termination of specific protective actions. On 30 September, the lifting of the former sheltering areas, 20 to 30 kilometer zone, was implemented. The termination should not be unduly delayed. In fact, prior to the accident, we did not have any specific guidance and criteria for termination of specific protective actions, so it took time to withdraw. The government established 3 criteria: status of plant conditions, this was important at this stage, dose level, and restoring public service functions. In developing the criteria, the good balance should be achieved between the radiological considerations and the non-radiological aspects, where we recognize the need to work closely with many authorities and organizations with experts in different disciplines. In the process of lifting of this area, the government only consulted with local governments, not including the affected people. From my point of view, this might cause the delay of further lifting of temporary relocation area during long-term phase. We have recognized the importance of involving and consulting all relevant stakeholders during the preparedness phase, as well as the transition phase to support, build public trust, and increasing the credibility of established arrangements in authorities, and it would contribute to wide social acceptance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Toshimitsu. I would just like to remind all the attendees, if you want to ask questions, you can do it in the chat area. You can direct it to all the panelists or to specific ones based on the topics of your interest. So in the chronology that Mr. Homma displayed, we saw that one aspect mentioned was also health surveillance, which is one of the crucial aspects in the transition phase. So Professor Elizabeth Cardis, you have done a major work in health surveillance in the nuclear and radiological field, and you are still contributing in the COVID-19 situation. Can you please tell us what does health surveillance mean first, and what did we learn from Chernobyl and Fukushima related to this aspect that might be relevant for COVID-19? I will also add some slides to support your talk.
Thank you, Fabiana. Well, what is health surveillance? It's basically the approach that we use to evaluate whether individuals affected by disasters suffer from health effects. This involves contact with and follow-up of affected populations, either through medical examinations repeated over time and or using questionnaires and surveys and so on. And it's a basis for providing support or treatment as required. And I should say that health here is taken as the WHO definition to be a complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Health surveillance has a lot of benefits. It's benefits for the participants themselves, who can get support, treatment, who can express their concerns. It's beneficial for society, for monitoring the evolution of the disease and of its consequences, and also for assessing the effectiveness of countermeasures taken in different transition phases. And finally, it's important for authorities, in particular the health sector, to identify the needs, to identify what works or doesn't work, and also identify individuals in particular vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. Based on lessons learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima, I've prepared a number of criteria for an effective health surveillance. First is prepare. One needs to have protocols and checklists for post-disaster surveillance in advance of an accident. And second one is engage stakeholders in designing and conducting health surveillance. Third is to identify the potentially affected populations and to propose their participation as soon as possible. So not waiting for the transition phase, but rather possibly in the emergency or in the confinement phase, starting already to engage them in health surveillance. And one thing that is extremely important is to clearly inform potential participants of the goals of the approach, the duration, and potential benefits to themselves and to society of the health surveillance, and of course that their participation in this is voluntary. And we need to ensure that we build a system that supports the individuals and populations that are included in the health surveillance, that evaluates the effectiveness of the measures taken, and abides with the ethical principles of dignity, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and ensure security of personal data. And finally, we need to standardize approach to assess and address health effects, particularly mental health effects, which may be difficult to characterize in an objective manner. Next slide, please. Just a few lessons learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima. At the beginning, much of the emphasis was on surveillance of direct somatic effects of radiation, including acute radiation sickness and cancer and non-cancer effects. But it became quite clear after Chernobyl, in particular after Fukushima, that the main health impact is probably indirect. It's the fact of the accident, the fact that you have radiation all around you. The remediation actions and surveillance also have an impact on health. It includes relocation and loss of home, social relations, work, control on one's life, uncertainties, receiving conflicting information, distrust, stigma, disruption of health services. And all of this leads to stress, to social and economic impacts in affected population and associated morbidity and mortality, including an epidemic of obesity in Fukushima children, diabetes, suicides, depression, and also avoidable deaths after the evacuation from lack of medical support. Next slide, please. Well, a lot of this really is translatable to the SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 situation. In health surveillance, clearly, we need to monitor the direct effect of the virus on infection, on pneumonia, and other severe health effects and death, on immunity, as well as the long-term impacts from COVID-related tissue damage on other diseases. But there's also the same indirect effects of the pandemic as we saw in Chernobyl and Fukushima. The social and economic impacts, including loss of job, reduced income, loss of home, hunger. There's the same uncertainties of conflicting information, distrust, stigma. There's the disruption of the normal health services because of the emergency. So all this has the same implications in terms of stress, depression, increased morbidity and mortality, mental health issues, including possibly PTSD in cured patients who are in the ICU, and increased severity of other diseases that may not be diagnosed or treated on time because of the capacity of the health system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for explaining and introducing us to the health surveillance aspects, which relate very much also to the COVID-19 situation. When we talk about transition phase, another crucial issue is also adopting good ethical values. Professor Le Chat, could you tell us what are the ethical values that underpin the radiation protection system that apply in the transition phase?
Yes, in the management of the transition phase, what is at stake is, of course, the protection of people against the radiation risk, but also to preserve as much as possible decent living and working conditions for the people. This is true for both the workers on site at the nuclear power plant and the general population in the affected areas. From an ethical point of view, these two objectives are part of the global ethical goal of all ethical theories, which, to sum up, is aiming to promote, on one side, the well-being of people at the level of individuals, and on the other side, the quality of the living together in the affected communities. This being said, how the basic principles of radiological protection can contribute to this double objective? Well, by doing more good than harm, the justification principle promotes the ethical values of beneficence and non-maleficence. By keeping all exposure as low as reasonably achievable, the optimization principle promotes the ethical value of prudence. And by limiting inequities in the distribution of exposures, the limitation principle promotes the ethical value of justice. To these four ethical values, the International Commission on Radiological Protection recently added the ethical value of dignity in order to treat people with respect. I will not comment further on the values of beneficence, non-maleficence, prudence, and justice, which are related to the three basic principles of radiological protection and which are relatively well documented. I will rather now focus on how the value of dignity is implemented in the transition phase, and of course also in the long-term phase. It is through the involvement of stakeholders. And this involvement has to be considered for two levels. First, with the implementation of the protective actions by authorities, and secondly, with the implementation of protective actions by the affected people themselves, the so-called self-help protection actions. The implementation of protective actions by authorities inevitably raise negative consequences. Decision makers have to face contradictory values. In most cases, the choices are not between black and white, but between gray, and even sometimes between black and black. Think, for example, of the decision to decontaminate the environment. It raised many ethical issues, as, for example, among them, the protection of the biodiversity, the transfer of risk between the public and the workers, how far to go in the decontamination, the difficult issue of the legacy of the waste resulting from the decontamination. This is always a complex decision-making process. And it is to note that there is no obvious order in the choice of the ethical values to privilege. This is why involving stakeholders in the decision-making process related to the choice of protective action is crucial. It allows taking into account more effectively their concerns and their expectations in order to ensure adhesion, maintain vigilance, and prevent later controversies. The experience of Chernobyl and Fukushima has also clearly demonstrated the importance of involving people in affected communities in a process of cooperation with experts and local authorities and professionals. This process, called the co-expertise process, emerged in Belarus in the 90s in the territories affected by the Chernobyl accident and was enriched.
Can you mute your mic? Thank you. Yes, please.
This process, called the co-expertise process, emerged in Belarus in the 90s in the territories affected by the Chernobyl accident, and it was enriched and refined in Japan after the Fukushima accident through the experience of various communities. The co-expertise process aims to share local knowledge of affected people and scientific expertise of researchers and experts for the purpose of assessing and better understanding the local radiological situation, to develop actions to allow people to protect themselves, and also improving the local living and working condition. The process is an integral part of the practical implementation of the optimization principle.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Another aspect that has been scientifically as well as practically proven to be of crucial relevance in decision-making, especially in the transition phase, is stakeholder involvement. Dr. Lazo, can you please tell us more about how is stakeholder involvement done in the transition phase? Who and why should be involved, as well as what are some challenges and some examples of it?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on what's been said. If you could have the first slide. In the emergency phase, the rule for communication with stakeholders is 3-9-27. 3 messages in 9 seconds, 27 words. The transition phase is after that, it's a little later. So I've got 4 messages, 15 seconds and 37 words. So I'm going to start with those first one. 1 click, please. What we know about stakeholders during the transition phase is that this is really the first time that they'll be interested in risks. In general, they know that there's a risky installation nearby that might cause some problem, but in general, stakeholders don't know much about radiation or radiation effects or chemical problems or whatnot. And so they will really only begin to think about it once the urgent aspects of things have been taken care of. They've been told to leave or not or whatever. But then when they have time to sit and start to think about things, then they'll be interested in risks, and they'll need information for that because they'll be taking decisions. The stakeholders, the decision-making will really shift from the institutional to the individual, where countermeasures and protective measures are implemented by governments and by local officials initially. That becomes more behavior aspects that the affected individuals will have to decide themselves whether they want to eat mushrooms, for example, or whether they want to live in the contaminated zone. Those are individual choices. So again, in order to make informed decisions, you don't want to influence what decisions they take. They're all valid. If you stay or leave, that's okay. But whether the decision is correctly informed is really an important aspect. Let's see, next click, please. We should be on the third bullet. Partnering is effective at building trust and supporting local initiatives. As Jacques Lochard just said, the co-expertise process is very important. The issue is that in order to make that work properly, you need to have trust, because the stakeholders need to believe that you're there to help and that you're going to engage with them. Jacques mentioned the core process that took place in Belarus. That was a very good example of partnering. Could you click again, please? The last of the four aspects that I want to talk about is highlighting the big picture, and that's essential to the optimization of protection. What I mean by the big picture is what's been to a certain extent discussed by the previous speakers. That is that these circumstances are in general extremely complex, multidimensional, and completely new and complex. If the focus is just on optimization of radiological protection, there's some problems with that, because there are dozens of other issues where doing the best you can for radiation protection, minimizing the exposure, for example, will cause other issues. Misuse or will prevent the use of funding for other aspects, for example. So looking at the big picture is really essential in order that the stakeholders, when they make decisions, are making a well-informed decisions that really optimizes their protection and their well-being in the broadest sense possible. So that's multidisciplinary, it's complex, it involves much beyond the radiation protection community. The social sciences, economics, local politics, NGOs, everybody's involved in all these different aspects. So stakeholder involvement during the transition period is when people begin to understand that they're part of the process. They begin to be actively interested in their own well-being, and they're going to talk to you. And you need to be ready and mandated as government and support technical organizations to listen, to address their concerns, and to help them move through the process of gaining understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. May I ask you, everyone who is not speaking, to mute your microphones, please. So one aspect that Edward mentioned, it was also the relevance of establishing a transparent and inclusive decision-making process. So I would like now to give the floor, or the screen in this case, to you, Dr. Catrinel Turcanu, to tell us what are the main factors influencing decision-making in the transition phase, as well as what are some uncertainties that you are faced with.
Thank you, Ferdiana. So when we talk about decisions, we have to acknowledge that there are decisions made at different levels: international, national, local, for instance, on reference levels, on countermeasure strategies, but also at individual level, how to deal with the situation, how to carry on with basic aspects of daily life. And what I would like to address in relation to decisions are three elements: the objectives, the uncertainties, and the criteria underlying decisions. And I would like to draw for this on findings from two recent European projects, Confidence and Engage. So the objective of decisions is often stated as preparing the return to normal, but the question is who decides what the new normal is? There are different perceptions and points of view on how to enact change in the transition phase. Decisions should not only be taken to reduce radiological risk, but also to account for broader considerations. For instance, establishing dignified living conditions, which would include also conditions to satisfy basic needs, possibility to act with others, to have fair institutional and political environment, and other similar resources. And the objective of decision-making has to be shaped together with stakeholders through engagement processes. One of the 10 lessons learned from the Fukushima booklet calls for participation of those affected by the disaster in the enactment and implementation of laws meant to protect them. And it is important to start this dialogue in the preparedness phase. However, in many countries, stakeholder networks that could support decision-making in the transition phase are not fully established or operational yet. And linked to that, we need to also broaden our thinking on who the stakeholders are, and to include also trusted actors, local leaders, nurses, general practitioners, citizen groups, media, parents, teachers, or representative organizations such as trade unions or NGOs. And also which forms of participation are recognized. We should recognize not only those initiated by authorities, but also more informal or citizen-led initiatives. And when defining objectives for decision-making, we should keep in mind that stakeholder engagement should not be used as a tool to increase acceptance of predefined options, but should aim at co-creating these options. And lessons learned showed that engagement is most effective when authorities show strong commitment for the process and when the processes are kept open and flexible with possibilities to move in and out of engagement. The second point relates to uncertainties. It is important to acknowledge and take into account uncertainties. There are scientific uncertainties, and some have been mentioned by previous speakers, but there are also social uncertainties, for instance, connected to daily life of affected people. How will I survive with my family if I cannot go in that area and I don't have my house? And we see these types of scientific and social uncertainties also in the COVID crisis. Is there a second wave? Will it be seasonal? How long will measures like wearing masks be necessary? What will be the economic impact? And preparedness is key also here, as it allows us to understand our vulnerabilities and reflect on which choices are most robust in the presence of uncertainties. And lessons learned after Fukushima showed that some actions did help address people's uncertainties. For instance, citizen measuring labs. So authorities should recognize the value of such initiatives and engage in joint reflection on how this may complement their own efforts. For instance, how can all this data provide a more complete operational picture in the transition phase? And linked to this is the last point, which criteria are taken into account when taking decisions and how? Both the accidents in Fukushima and Chernobyl and also in the COVID crisis shown that social, psychological, and economic consequences are at least as important as those directly related to the risk in question. And this is known and recognized, yet many times we see a discourse that leans onto a narrower view, focusing on only one dimension, be it economic, political, or radiological risk, or so on. And this may lead to ineffective decisions. And ICRP points out, for instance, that the level of exposure depends also on behaviors. We see this also now with the relaxation of emergency measures, for instance, people queuing for hours at shops that reopened. And not only one science can provide an answer to which decisions are best in such a situation. Several disciplines have to come together. And authorities, researchers, other stakeholders need to reflect on these dimensions in the preparedness phase. And moreover, decision support tools such as multi-criteria analysis methods can be used to make the potential impact of decisions transparent, and also they can make transparent the importance given to these different impacts before decisions are taken. And methods of these types are helpful because they take into account both technical and non-technical factors, and they can also support stakeholder engagement processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrinel. So besides telling us what factors influence decision-making, you also touched upon uncertainties that we are faced with. And given that uncertainty is a characteristic of almost all situations, including the nuclear or radiological ones, as well as the COVID-19 situation, I would like to ask Dr. Chiara McMahon a question. So considering that we don't know what the emergency situation will be, and added to this is the uncertainty of what impacts the early response will have, how can we possibly plan for the transition phase?
Thank you very much. Well, certainly there's huge uncertainties from this point about identifying what the emergency could be, how it might play out, what the weather conditions would be at the time, and lots of different factors to add in. There's also generally the feeling that the transition phase, there's time to develop the arrangements that need to be put in place. And I think that sometimes puts authorities off making plans for this particular area because they know they'll have to adapt these plans. But when we consider all of the factors that have to be put in place, all of the arrangements that are required, and we've heard about some of them already, and all of this has to be done under the pressure from society and from politicians and government to reopen society, to reopen economy, to get things back to a new normal. So just as for example, during the transition phase, you're going to have to assess the radiological consequences, but also impacts such as psychosocial impacts, economic impacts and costs, cultural impacts, environmental impacts, as well as agreeing conditions and criteria for lifting, adapting or introducing new protective actions, arrangements for communication and consultation with the public and other interested parties I've already heard about, the role and protection of public volunteers, as well as protection of workers and an expanded pool of workers that have to be expanded in the recovery operations, monitoring for the environment and for health and doses, medical follow-up registry, waste management becomes a big issue in the transition phase, the development of a strategy for restoration of infrastructure, workplaces, public protection, sharing of information and data, particularly if there's a change of authority and responsibility as the sort of time since the emergency progresses. And compensation as well will become an issue that will start to increase in people's minds during the transition phase. So as you can see there's a huge amount of things that have to be considered. And for radiation protection authorities that I'm from, you're potentially going to be involved in some manner in all of these, whether it's giving radiological protection advice or helping to set criteria. So we don't have time to go into even a fraction of these, but just to say, for example, in terms of working with new organizations, because we get to the transition phase, the first responders are now leaving the scene, and if they were leading on the response, there's going to be a new organization who's coming into the response. There's also going to be a shift in the way of working. It's going to go from more some command and control to more collaborative and consultative, with more and more decision makers, because as already mentioned, the individuals are going to be decision makers. So as authorities, we have to make that shift as well. So we have to ask, do we have the flexibility to be able to do that, to make that move? Have we trained people? We often train people on command and control, but have we identified the right people who are good at the consultation and the collaboration pieces? Because they are a different set of skills. It's like moving from a sprint at the beginning to a marathon in the transition and recovery phase. And we know that even if somebody is a runner, just because they're a good sprinter doesn't mean they're a good marathon runner, and vice versa. We certainly can't plan for the same level of detail for these things, but we can agree things. We can agree criteria for lifting, adapting and introducing actions. They may need to be adapted, even the criteria. But if we don't agree them, and anybody who's been involved in developing dose criteria in peacetime knows how challenging it is when you have lots of time and ability to discuss and to consult with different groups. If you're trying to do that after an emergency has occurred, you're not going to have the time to do that very thoroughly. You're also not going to have the trust, because people will assume that once the emergency is completed, that they're going to go back to normal dose limits. They're going to assume that the 1 millisievert per year applies. We know that if there's residual contamination, this may not be immediately possible. And we're going to have to live with an increased risk compared to what existed before. So you need to have done the work in identifying potential stakeholder groups in advance, and build relationships with them possible, and certainly having agreed the mechanisms for decision-making and mechanisms for consultation with various groups as well. As I said, we can't plan for the same level of detail as we can for the urgent phase, but we can develop criteria, we can agree the mechanisms, and we can have a framework in place that can be adapted. It has to be flexible, and exercises can be run as well, not in the same way, not command post exercises and drills, but workshopping and tabletop exercises involving stakeholder organizations if possible as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for giving us a great introduction and your perspectives on the preparedness stage. Now we would like to have a discussion with all of the panelists who will answer the questions asked by the participants of the webinar. We received many questions from our participants. Nadia has summarized them and sent a couple of them to me. So the first question is directed to all of the participants. So how do we quantify and compare non-radiological criteria to the radiological criteria? Which are more significant? Can you please suggest specific non-radiological criteria to be considered for evacuation, if any? Yes, Edward?
Thank you very much. This is a topic that is being discussed a lot these days. And it's the issue is that a lot of these different risks and circumstances are not comparable. It's hard to numerically or with criteria compare economic costs to psychological risks, to radiological risks, to social disruption. All those can be individually looked at, but they're very difficult to quantify such that they can be balanced in making a decision for protection. What's the best choice for the well-being of the individuals when all these big picture items are happening at the same time? So I think it's hard to say that this one is the most important. They're all important in one way or another, and they're going to be very case specific and individual specific to a certain extent. So I think one of the things that one of the research bits that we need to look at closely is how things can be well compared. I think that's, for me, a key issue for the coming future.
Thank you. Would anyone else like? Okay, Jacques? Just a quick.
Yes,
a bit late.
I think this is what I mentioned in my short presentation. I think there is no obvious order. I mean, you have to take into account many dimensions: social, economical, ethical ones, of course, radiological one, and there is no way to compare them, to evaluate them, and to have an algorithm to decide what is the most important. This is why stakeholder involvement is the key issue, because this is the result of the decision-making process, including stakeholder involvement, which will give the order of the priorities. But there is no way to quantify the non-radiological criteria versus the radiological criteria and to make a decision without involving the stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Thierry, you can continue, but please quickly, because we have many questions. And
okay. So very quickly, in fact, in the past, we had the dream to use cost-benefit analysis to do that. That was a mathematical calculation. What we may need to emphasize, of course, we cannot have a magic system allowing to quantify everything and to compare everything. However, there is a need to have a good assessment and a joint assessment of the situation. And it's why with stakeholders, some element can be quantified, some element can be just explicitly discussed and see what are the expectation of the different people and in which way they do that. So maybe with regard to that, I think that some approach developed in social science could help to set up this type of process and dialogue process together with the stakeholder, having in mind that we will have no magic situation where we will be able to quantify and classify the criteria.
Thank you. Is it okay if we go to the next question and then everyone will have a chance to speak about the next one? So the second question is, how is the term public acceptance being understood by experts, regulators, etc.? Is this simply being assumed, or is acceptance actively sought? Yes, Chiara?
Well, hopefully it's actively sought, and we cannot assume acceptance by people. And that's, I suppose, one area where preparedness is really important. Because if we have developed a protection strategy or a strategy for protection of the food chain, we have an opportunity in preparedness to run that by, to co-create it, as Catherine described it, with stakeholder groups. So whether if it's for protection of the food chain, they might be farmers, representative groups, retailers, food production companies, consumer agencies, and so on. So you can discuss what's technically feasible and also what's acceptable to those particular groups in preparedness. And then by doing that as well, you've also developed a relationship that you can have then when things have to be adapted during the emergency, and particularly during the transition phase, that group is already aware of why those protection strategy was chosen in the first place.
Would anyone else like to add something to this? Yes, Thierry.
Yeah, maybe briefly. I think one of the key points, we may have a dialogue with community in order to see what are their expectations. But at the end, this is individual decision, and we need to respect individual decisions. So the acceptance itself is not universal. The key point is really, as it was mentioned during the previous speech, to respect the dignity and to respect the individual decision, and of course to inform them, but to respect at the end.
Thank you. Katrina, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I wanted to add that I'm a bit reluctant to hear a lot about public acceptance as a criterion. For instance, I think we should open this box and understand what is really important for people, what their concerns are, and take this into consideration in the decision-making process.
Thank you. Another interesting question that we got is, there is no stakeholder involvement in the pandemic as far as I'm aware. Is that because we are not yet in the transition phase? Are viruses different to radionuclides? Yes, Edward.
Thank you very much. I think there is, in a sense, stakeholder involvement going on, because the first step of stakeholder involvement, or a key step, is listening to what they have to say. Because there, as was just mentioned, decisions are going to be, of individuals are going to be different and need to be respected. But in order to respect something, you need to understand what it is. So there's an enormous amount of discussion at the moment, particularly in the United States, of relaxing the quarantine or maintaining it. And that's an extremely difficult decision. And it's multidimensional and complex in a lot of different ways. So listening to people from both sides is what I think is important. And that's really the first step. But there should be a mandate by the government to acknowledge what stakeholders have said and try and reflect that as best possible. You can't please everybody, but as best possible in the decisions.
Thank you. Yes, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think there is stakeholder involvement. Well, as Ted was mentioning, already just the needs that are manifested by the people, but also, for example, in the work that's being done in terms of health surveillance. There are a lot of health surveillance projects being set up here and everywhere. And certainly the ones we're setting up here very much take into account the concerns and the needs of the stakeholders in general, mainly the general population, as well as health authorities. And we try to develop the questionnaires and so on in collaboration, kind of co-create the questionnaires and the health surveillance with them.
Thank you. Yes, Chiara.
Yeah, just another example, I think, of where there is stakeholder engagement is in development of back to work plans at national levels. In some countries that includes consultation and co-creation with the trade unions of representative bodies for different groups of workers in terms of what protective actions need to be put into workplaces to allow factories to reopen and so on.
Thank you. The next question is a similar one, but more general in nature. So what do you see as similarities and differences when talking about partnering in relation to affected areas in the case of Chernobyl and Fukushima versus a global pandemic? So what are the differences and similarities? Would anyone like to address? Yes, Chiara.
Maybe this is something that we discussed in preparing this webinar. In fact, it's quite difficult to really draw the lessons from what is going on with the pandemic situation in the transition phase. That will be maybe arrogant from our side to explain what people have to do based on our lesson from Fukushima and Chernobyl. We can only emphasize the fact that this transition phase, there are some similarities, there are some differences. We have not investigated in detail how it's going on. You had just this question on participation of the public. This is something which is going on in the pandemic phase. We have no feedback, so it's the reason why I think this is an important issue, but I will be not in position to respond nowadays. This is something to further investigate for the future from my side.
Thank you. Chiara, did you want to add something? No, okay. We have one question for Mr. Toshimitsu. But of course, if you feel that you can also answer, you can add something to Toshimitsu's answer. So the question is why the term evacuation was used for such a long time when different criteria changed in time, and terms as relocation and resettlements were not used at all, or were not introduced with clear criteria in case of Fukushima accident. Under my opinion, it could be helpful to distinguish also with different terms, different conditions, and different criteria introduced. What are the reasons this was not the case in Japan? So why evacuation was used for a long time where relocation and resettlement not?
First of all, that's the English evacuation prior to the Fukushima accident, in our guidance by the former Nuclear Safety Commission, only we have the criteria for evacuation, short evacuation during the emergency phase. But we don't have any criteria for relocation. We didn't think about relocation, temporary relocation, or resettlements. So that's in the Japanese document, always the term used in evacuation. But in the expert field and also regulatory field, now we use the temporary relocation or the resettlement, and that depends on also the different criteria.
Thank you. Would anyone? Yes, Ted.
If I may take a step back to the last question, yes, about partnering, I think things have evolved from Chernobyl to Fukushima to the pandemic, in the sense that in Chernobyl there was most of the partnering, if I can put it that way, was to do with radiological aspects. In Fukushima, the psychological aspects become much more significant, at least recognized and discussed. And now with the pandemic, the number of aspects that are completely different that are being addressed in terms of economic and social and health and whatnot is skyrocketing. So that I think there's been a recognition and evolution in the recognition of the complexity of these situations and of the aspects that need to be addressed to come up with optimum solutions.
Thank you. We have one question for Elizabeth. One participant asked whether health surveillance depend on received dose.
Well, I think this relates to the actual goal of the health surveillance. So, one could study, one can say, I want to study the health impact of the radiation on, the direct health impact of radiation on the risk of some somatic diseases like leukemia in children, for example, something like that. Then there, obviously, if you're talking about a population that has had very, very low doses, a health surveillance exercise, if their doses of the order of what you get in 1 year of natural background radiation, health surveillance is not going to be terribly useful. So I think health surveillance generally should be much broader. And if we take into account the psychosocial and economic effects, which have an important impact on mortality and morbidity, that is irrespective of dose levels, and that's more what we are proposing.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next question is directed to Jacques. The question is as follows. In addition to the ethical principles of radiation protection as presented by you on behalf of ICRP, many people now realize with the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic how important the principle of solidarity is in managing the crisis. People not only act to protect themselves, but mainly to protect people that are more vulnerable than themselves. Do you see this value as equally important in radiation protection?
Yes, of course. I think in the 5 minutes I didn't went into details, but in the forthcoming publication of ICRP on the protection of people and the environment in the event of a large nuclear accident, we are addressing this issue. I mean, the problem of taking special care about vulnerable people, which is, of course, a manifestation of solidarity, but also solidarity in a broader sense. I mean, the fact that people from affected territories tend to be or feel abandoned, or there is some discrimination with regards to them. Solidarity is a crucial point. There are many, beyond the key core values that I have presented, there are many other ethical values. I think, for example, to the value of empathy, which is crucial in the question of the co-expertise process. I mean, listening to people, trying to understand their concern. You need to really put yourself in the shoes of the others. And I fully agree that solidarity is very important. It is interesting to note that in the case of the COVID-19, solidarity was immediately on the forefront because all people are concerned in the society. But in the case of a nuclear accident, you have those who are affected and you have those who are not affected. And it makes a huge difference. And the issue about the solidarity, the fact that those who are outside the affected territories are looking at those who are inside the territories as special people makes a lot of difference. And this is one challenge of the transition phase and the long-term phase, to develop solidarity between those who are affected and those who are not. And within the affected territories, solidarity in the co-expertise process, you have obviously solidarity. I mean, everywhere in communities where they work together and try to understand their own situation, inevitably there is solidarity. So I think it was a good question, and but I think it is important to make this distinction between the COVID, where all people are concerned, nobody escape, potentially, and in the case of a nuclear accident, you have only those who are affected. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, thank you, Jacques. We have one question for Gabriel. So also the management of COVID crisis had and still has to face huge uncertainties. There were interesting discussions on the role of the expert and on the respective responsibilities of scientists and politicians. Is this also the case relevant for nuclear emergencies?
This is for me?
Yes, should I repeat the question maybe?
Yeah, please.
Also, the management of COVID crisis has to face huge uncertainties, not only on the nature and health consequences of the virus, but also on the effectiveness of countermeasures, their economic and social costs, and on the willingness of people to abide by government decisions. There were interesting discussions on the role of experts and on the respective responsibilities of scientists and politicians. Is this also relevant to nuclear emergencies?
Well, I think so, because in the aftermath of an emergency and also in the transition phase, which is the topic of the webinar now, there are a lot of factors that have to be put into balance, and there are decisions are always influenced by political, by economic factors, and I think this is common to a nuclear emergency or to this pandemic. We know that sometimes decisions are taken which can lead to very high costs or very high amount of waste being generated, and you know, the main factors driving this are, yes, many times of political nature.
Thank you. We have a lot of many other questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So I would like to maybe address some of these questions by a broader one, by asking all the panelists, where do you think future research should focus on related to the transition phase? We can start with Thierry.
Okay, thank you. So I will not go too much in detail. I just would like to emphasize the fact that within NERIS, we have produced a strategic research agenda that you can find on our website, and we are currently preparing the roadmap for the implementation of this research agenda. And there is also another joint roadmap which have been prepared within the CONCERT project together with all the other research platform in radiation protection. So this is some element which could be quite valuable, and SHARE as also is strategic research agenda. Among all these elements, you can find some quite interesting issue. I just want to emphasize the 3 points. The first one we just discussed is this question of consideration on uncertainties. The uncertainties, we need to go a step further, and it's not only with regard to the assessment, but it's also with regard to the management. The second point is the development of guidance for a holistic approach, and notably including some interaction with what is going on with COVID-19 management. And the last one is to further investigate the role and responsibility of the different stakeholders and the cooperation process, because we have seen that this is something quite important, notably in order to improve preparedness and response.
Thank you. Mr. Toshimitsu, you can continue. We cannot hear you now. Yes.
I think recently under the NRA budget, we have a research plan on consideration of non-radiological aspect for implementing evacuation that we have already discussed about the, in case of the evacuation, non-radiological effect is also important from the point of view of justification of protective actions. That's one lesson learned from Fukushima. There were the tragedy that's more than 50 people died, patients and elderly people who transport to the evacuation, outside the evacuation zone. So that's the, this kind of needs comparison between radiological and non-radiological consequence. My proposal is a research on development of a process and criteria for termination of individual protective measures with taken into account in integration of both radiological and non-radiological concepts, not comparison. And the other point is regarding the COVID-19. In case of COVID is a processing simultaneously globally. So there are many different kind of strategy of protection people from this infection, depending on the basic circumstances, such medical system, economic and social structure and cultural background of each country. So I think it is a good opportunity to compare the lessons learned from these difference in response of various countries and to improve the feedback from the feedback to improve the strategy for preparation and response that best fit of own country for for the resumption of normal activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Elizabeth, can you continue? Cannot hear.
Yes, okay. Sorry. Well, I think research is needed in preparedness to co-create with all appropriate stakeholders, protocols and checklists for health surveillance in post-disaster situations. I mean, we should ensure that these health surveillance protocols allow evaluating the effectiveness of measures to inform radiation protection and public health actions. And they should focus not just on the direct somatic effects of the particular agents, radiation for nuclear accidents, but also on the psychosocial and economic effects, which can greatly affect the health of the affected populations. And in the transition phase, I think what we need to do, if the appropriate health surveillance systems are in place, is use these to evaluate the effectiveness of the measures taken, effectiveness of the communication with the affected people, and feed this into the decision making about measures, whether things should be stricter or not, and how to best improve the protection of the population. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Jacques Lechard, can we hear your recommendations? Yes.
I think it's a key issue is how to refine the so-called co-expertise process. I think this is a relatively new way of presenting how to work with affected people in a post-accident situation. And I think there are good experience already to build on, but it would be nice to develop guidance, particularly to help experts and local authorities how to involve people, how to communicate effectively with them, how to build trust. And in this perspective, I think it would be very good to revisit the key lessons from the whole history of risk assessment and risk management, risk perception, risk communication, and even more recently, risk governance, how all the lessons we have learned from these disciplines, how they should be integrated and into the co-expertise process in a more coherent way. I think at the moment, this co-expertise process is relying on people who goodwill, willingness to work with the population, who involve themselves voluntarily and spend a lot of time with the people. But I think we see that there is some sort of limitation about that. And in the future, it should be necessary to diffuse that more largely. And I think working on that is a really important issue.
Thank you very much. Can we continue with you, Dr. Edward Lazo?
Yes, thank you very much. I think following up on what's already been said, in the United States, we have a saying that opinions are like any bodily parts you want. Everybody's got one. And so the process in these circumstances where there's a huge number of different disciplines and things involved needs not so much research, but needs some sort of a coordination process within ministries in the government, with stakeholders, with local governments, with regional governments. What sort of processes, as Jacques was saying, need to be managed or developed so that this coordination, this multidisciplinary coordination can be accomplished. And I think even just the assessment of all the different aspects, all the risks and all the consequences of taking decisions, all that needs to be on the table in order to make a good decision. And there needs to be, you'd like to have a common understanding of those risks, but that's a communications issue and is extremely difficult to accomplish, but it's something that could be looked at. And in that context, again, as Jacques said, what's the best stakeholder involvement process? What experience have we had that is effective in different circumstances? It'll be different. It's very case specific, but it'll be important to look at what we have. And as Elizabeth said, I think it's important to look at what can be planned. because there's so much uncertainty in a lot of these circumstances that you can only plan so much, but you'll need to create resources when you need them. So they need to be there needs to be a plan so that the amount of effort you need can be brought to bear in a quick sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we go quickly, Catrinel, to hear your recommendations, and then Chiara, because we are really running out of time.
Yes, very fast, 2 points. One, I think there should be more attention to how to identify vulnerabilities in the preparedness phase and how to think jointly with various stakeholders on how to address these vulnerabilities. And then a second point is how to assess the impact of non-radiological factors and to develop decision aid tools that can include both these radiological and non-radiological factors into decision making in a way that also supports stakeholder engagement.
Thank you. Chiara? Yes.
Yeah, and just to build on what other people have said, I think we have to learn from the COVID-19 situation, and when in the future, when the transition phase has already happened there, to learn about, obviously countries have different strategies, but they also have chosen different strategies in terms of how to communicate their strategy, how to incorporate different actors in decision making, and how to engage with society. So I think we need to learn from that and what the impact of those decisions were, those strategies, in terms of public adherence to the measures that are being proposed by governments, but also the psychological impact of the various strategies that have been adopted, because we're in a situation where we're moving to a reduced but non-zero risk, and that's very similar to residual nuclear contamination after an emergency. So I think we really have to get as much information as we can and take it back to nuclear radiological emergency planning as well.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite NERIS representative Deborah Otton and then SHARE President Susan Hodgson in order to give a summary and some concluding remarks for the webinar. We cannot hear you, Deborah.
Yes, to summarize that extremely rich discussion, and we've only taken a fraction of the comments in the chat line. I was asked to say something on behalf of NERIS, so I shall just make a quick observation. What can we learn from COVID-19 management? I think we can also learn how not to do it. And if we see some of the approaches of governments around the world, I see examples of what we used to call in the old days, decide, announce, defend approach to managing a risk, the DAD approach. And I think if we look at some of the governments around the world, we'll see the ones that are being most successful tend to be the ones with female leaders. You might think what that means. Now, as opposite to the DAD approach, some of you know what's coming there. It's nearly 15 years ago we were discussing this, and I think it was Rick Jones came up, at least in the nuclear preparedness awareness, of the MUM approach, the meet, understand, and modify approach, which I think we here in NERIS and SHARE are more familiar with. So all the men around the table here, I would say, were definite examples of the meet, understand, modify approach. And I think that underlines what the SHARE and the NERIS approach to emergency preparedness. Now, this is not direct gender, because people have also queried, for example, the catastrophe in England, and I'm keeping, yeah, what would be the case if Thatcher was in charge? Yes, would it be better or worse? So I'm not being gender discriminative here. It's a state of mind, meet, understand, modify. So power to the women. But on a cautionary phase, we did do a lot of stakeholder engagement, including NGOs, right back in the beginning of the millennium. And there was a quote by one of our NGOs who said, and I've got the paper up here, and if you want it, I'll send it to you. He was worried that dad is not being replaced by mum, but the wicked uncle. And the wicked uncle being unlimited nuclear consultation leading to exhaustion. And I think picking up on what Jacques said about really respecting the amount of effort that's being placed on, we've seen it in Fukushima. I think we're also seeing it we will see it in COVID as well. the people who are being involved and recognizing the amount of effort it actually takes to do that kind of involvement. So that's my time. I have to mention that the next seminar will be run by NERIS, the webinar on the Chernobyl fire case. So you will be getting an invitation to that in your mailboxes very soon. But thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Susan, you may continue.
Okay, thank you very much. And first, thank you to the panelists and obviously all of the hundreds of participants. We'll be collating the questions that haven't been responded and perhaps circulating them. A couple of things that I wanted to pick up on. Katrinelle mentioned the need to open the black box of the term acceptance. I think that's a real research priority. Several people mentioned the idea of co-creation and co-expertise and what would that actually look like in practice and how might we disseminate that more widely. And then this idea of how to weight incommensurable categories when you're having to make decisions often quite quickly. So that obviously emphasizes the need for preparedness, which we're all recognizing, but perhaps we still need to pay a lot of research attention to that trying things out before something happens. Some of these are going to be picked up in the future. Do look up the latest news in relation to the RICOMET conference, because now the 1st to the 3rd of September, we have a pre-RICOMET, which will be a series of online events. Because obviously we've had to move the RICOMET 2020 conference to next summer. We'll be going to Athens for RICOMET, but the original dates will be a series of online events at the start of September, and we'll pick up some of these topics and we hope people will register and take part. But thank you again, everybody. Back to you, Ferdiana.
Thank you, both of you. And with this, I would like to close today's webinar with 2 minutes delay. I would like to thank all of our speakers for their insights and contributions they provided, and also a big thank you to all the participants showing their interest for these very intriguing topics. As I said, we had around 350 participants from all around the world. So thank you for joining the third SHARE webinar. We hope that with this webinar we have answered some of your questions, although we did not manage to answer them all, as well as we hope that we brought you new perspectives related to the transition phase in general. SHARE and NERIS will continue organizing similar activities, and you can find more information and news on our websites and Twitter page. I wish you all the best and see you next time.